Hi, I'm Dr Emilia Thompson. I'm a registered nutritionist with the Association for Nutrition. I'm also an educator in sport nutrition. I have a PhD in physiology and an MSc in sport nutrition. Now I work predominantly as an online coach and educator. This video is going to cover intermittent fasting for fat loss. What is intermittent fasting? Intermittent fasting has gained popularity in recent years as a method for weight loss. It involves periods of eating interspersed with periods of fasting, and usually these fasting windows last for about 12 to 48 hours at about 60% or more energy restriction. Time restricted feeding, which falls within that intermittent fasting category, tends to relate to periods of eating roughly 8 to 10 hours every day, where the rest of the time outside of that 8 to 10 hours involves fasting. So how does intermittent fasting actually work for fat loss? Ultimately, intermittent fasting works by creating a calorie deficit. Although calories don't have to be counted for fat loss, they do still count. So if you're someone that hates the idea of tracking your macros and counting calories every day, intermittent fasting could potentially be a good option for you, because what it does is it reduces your opportunity for eating, therefore reduces your calorie intake without actually having to count calories. There is some evidence that suggests that actually intermittent fasting reduces the opportunity for snacking, especially at night. So if you're like me, for example, and have stashes of dairy milk in your fridge and like to reach for it after the day is done, intermittent fasting can stop that snacking, because if your eating window doesn't include after 8 o'clock, then you don't get to snack on the chocolate. There is also some evidence that suggests that pushing your breakfast back by just an hour and a half and bringing your dinner forward by an hour and a half can result in a calorie deficit and result in fat loss. So for some people that wouldn't mind having their breakfast pushed back by an hour and a half, I personally would, then that potentially will reduce calorie intake and therefore produce a calorie deficit. Is intermittent fasting actually better than continuous dieting for fat loss? A review published in 2019 looked at 11 different studies that did all different types of intermittent fasting, and what they found is, compared to regular dieting, there was no difference in weight loss or fat loss between people who did intermittent fasting and people who continuously dieted. More recently, a study published in 2020 actually looked at two different strategies. They compared time restricted feeding with a 16 to 8 ratio, so people were allowed to eat within 8 hours and fast for 16 hours, versus people who followed a meal structure of 3 meals a day. And they looked at not only fat loss, but they also looked at lean muscle mass, and they also looked at different cardiometabolic factors. And what they found after the 12 weeks, shock horror, there was no difference in fat loss between intermittent fasting and continuous energy restriction. What was quite cool though is that the people who did intermittent fasting actually exhibited greater lean mass loss than the people who did continuous energy restriction. So that actually suggested a potential downside in terms of body composition for people who did time restricted feeding. There was no difference in cardiometabolic factors. So things like resting blood glucose, blood lipids weren't different between the two groups. So what are the potential downsides of intermittent fasting? You might be thinking, wow, that sounds great. I don't need to count my calories, I don't need to track my macros, and I will lose body fat. Unless you're someone like me who needs to eat regularly every 3 hours, or you turn a little bit unfavourable. However, there is some research that suggests that actually intermittent fasting reduces energy expenditure. So for example, if you are intermittent fasting on 2 days across the week, there is some research that suggests that your activity levels on those days reduces. And potentially more recent research that was published in 2020 actually highlighted that not only does physical activity reduce on the days before and the days after people fast, but also what happens is that people tend to eat more on the days before they fast and on the days after, suggesting that actually people might compensate for these fasting days. The latter study had a calorie deficit of 2,000 calories, or so they had planned. What actually happened is, because people reduced their expenditure and because they increased their intake, that calorie deficit was reduced by about 50%. So that calorie deficit went from 2,000 calories over one day to 1,000 calories. So there's still a deficit there, but it's half of what they planned because people were compensating. Are there any other benefits to intermittent fasting aside from fat loss? There is some evidence in the emerging field of chrononutrition that highlights that actually eating more calories earlier in the day might potentially be beneficial for cardiometabolic health. And that's because of differences in things like blood glucose control, gastric emptying, autophagy, and diet-induced thermogenesis. However, if you're watching this and you're somebody who regularly exercises, this probably isn't applicable to you. Okay, so should you try intermittent fasting? Ultimately, it's going to be a lifestyle choice. If intermittent fasting works for you, say you don't like to track your macros and actually you're quite happy to skip meals, you're happy to push your breakfast back and it doesn't bother you too much, then great, intermittent fasting might work really well for you to promote fat loss. However, again, if you're someone like me who likes to wake up and your stomach is shouting at you to eat, then intermittent fasting might not work so well for you. It's very much a personal preference. Again, there's some evidence that suggests that if you're somebody who regularly eats breakfast, you take it away, that could potentially lead to mindless eating later in the day. That being said, if you're somebody who is quite happy to miss breakfast, if you take that away, you might not even really notice a difference and you're reducing your calorie intake. It's your choice. I hope you found this video on intermittent fasting useful. Remember to like and subscribe to the Myprotein channel for more nutrition and fitness content. If there's anything that you'd like to see, make sure to leave it in the comments below. See you next time.